The primary nexus pulsed with energy, systems that had lain dormant for millennia now fully awakened. Carla stood at the central interface, watching as luminous forms of the evolved consciousnesses moved through the vast chamber like schools of exotic fish, their hybrid existence a fluid dance between matter and energy. It had been only 3 hours since the activation, yet it felt as if he'd witnessed the birth of a new world. "Fesher," Sophia called, her voice pulling him from his reverie. "You need to see this." Carlos reluctantly turned from the hypnotic patterns of the evolved consciousnesses. Sophia stood at a secondary terminal, her fingers dancing across interfaces that blended repository technology with the equipment they'd brought. The scientist's expression was tense, focused in a way that immediately put Carlos on alert. "What is it?" he asked, moving to join her. "The repository's defensive measures," Sophia replied, gesturing to a display showing the status of various systems throughout Sector 19. "They're not neutralizing the corporate forces as Ray suggested they would. They're containing them, but the containment is selective." Carlos studied the display, seeing what had caught Sophia's attention. The phase barriers that had formed after the activation weren't uniformly deployed. Some corporate teams were fully blocked, while others were merely redirected or slowed. There wasn't random. There was a pattern to it that suggested purpose. "It's as if the repository is allowing certain corporate elements to remain active," Sophia continued, almost like it's observing their response. Before Carlos could reply, a deep rumble shook the chamber, causing dust and fragments to rain down from the high ceiling. The evolved consciousnesses reacted instantly, their luminous forms pulsing with increased intensity. "What was that?" Dex demanded, weapon already in hand as she moved to a defensive position near the main entrance. Malik checked a scanner. Explosions at the outer perimeter. Multiple detonations. He looked up, his expression grim. "They're not retreating. Salvage Corp is launching a counter-offensive." "That's insane," Jensen said, his form now partially evolved after exposure to the primary nexus energy. "They must know they can't overcome repository defenses with conventional weapons." Another explosion rocked the chamber, this one closer. The luminous forms of the evolved consciousnesses scattered, some fading temporarily from the material plane. "I don't think those are conventional weapons," Carlos said, feeling a strange resonance in his mind, an echo of discomfort from the evolved collective. "They've developed something specific to repository systems." Trask, who had been exploring an adjacent chamber, rejoined the group. "We need to establish a secure perimeter. If they've developed anti-repository technology, our assumptions about safety here are compromised." "How could they have anti-repository weapons?" Dex asked. "They've been trying to understand this technology for decades without success." "Perhaps they understand more than we realized," Trask replied, his expression unreadable. Carlos felt a chill at the words, but had no time to dwell on it as Sophia called out again. "I'm detecting a new chamber," she announced, excitement temporarily overriding concern. "The activation sequence has revealed sections of the primary nexus that weren't accessible before." She pointed to a passage that had appeared in the eastern wall of the main chamber. "According to these readings, it contains historical archives." "Historical?" Jensen moved closer, his partially evolved form casting odd shadows. "From the builders." "Yes," Sophia confirmed. "And potentially information about other repository installations." "Other installations?" Carlos repeated. "There are more like this one?" The question hung in the air as another explosion shook the chamber, considerably closer this time. "Whatever's in there," Trask said decisively, "it might help us understand what we're facing. Sophia, Jensen, come with me to investigate the archive chamber. Malik, Dex, establish defensive positions here. Fisher." "I should go with you," Carlos interrupted, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the newly revealed chamber. "My connection to the repository might help access the archives." Trask hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. The rest of you stay alert. If corporate forces breach the outer defenses, fall back to the secondary nexus point we passed on our way in." As Carlos followed Trask, Sophia, and Jensen toward the archive chamber, the rumble of distant explosions created an ominous backdrop to their progress. The passageway was unlike others they'd encountered, the walls inscribed with more complex patterns, the ambient light shifting through spectrums beyond normal human perception. Carlos found he could see these additional colors, another sign of how his connection to the repository was changing him. The passage opened into a hexagonal chamber dominated by a central crystalline structure that reached from floor to ceiling. Unlike the organic fluidity of other repository technology, this structure had a rigid, precise geometry that suggested deliberate information architecture. "It's a data core," Sophia breathed, approaching the crystal structure with reverent caution. "Possibly the primary historical archive for this entire installation." Jensen circled the structure, his partially evolved form resonating with the energy patterns emanating from the crystal. "I can sense information stored here, but it's locked behind protocols we haven't encountered before." Carlos stepped forward, drawn to a recessed panel at the base of the crystal. Its surface bore patterns similar to those on his original cube, the repository marker that had started them on this path. Without conscious decision, he placed his palm against the panel. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Information flooded his consciousness, not in the controlled stream he'd experienced previously, but as a torrent of images, concepts, and sensory impressions too rapid to process. He staggered, would have fallen if Jensen hadn't caught him. "Fisher?" Sophia moved to help, but Carlos raised a hand to stop her. "I'm all right," he managed, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "It's just a lot to process." The information was organizing itself in his mind, translating into concepts his human consciousness could comprehend. He saw star maps, planetoids, construction sequences, and most strikingly, a network of installations identical to Repository 11 spread across distant star systems. "There are others," he said aloud, the realization crystallizing. "Repository 11 isn't unique. It's part of a network. There are 10 others." "10?" Trask stepped closer, his interest piqued. "You're certain?" Carlos nodded, still sorting through the information streaming into his consciousness. "They're numbered. This is the 11th in the sequence." "Why call it Repository 11?" Sophia wondered. "Why not just the repository if it's a unique installation?" "Because it's not unique," Carlos realized, the implication settling like a stone in his stomach. The designation is part of its identity within a larger network, a sequence. Before he could elaborate, a familiar luminous form manifested in the chamber. Ray, her evolved consciousness taking shape with more stability than the others they'd seen. "Carlos," her voice resonated directly in their minds. "Corporate forces have breached a secondary entrance to the primary nexus. They're deploying technology designed to disrupt evolved consciousness." "How is that possible?" Sophia demanded. "They shouldn't have the knowledge to develop such technology." Ray's form pulsed with what Carlos interpreted as concern. "They have had access to repository technology longer than you realize. The weapons they're using incorporate principles from Guardian vessels, modified to destabilize rather than process." Another explosion rocked the chamber, this one close enough that dust and crystal fragments rained down from the ceiling. The crystal archive structure emitted a high-pitched tone that made everyone wince. "We need to move," Trask ordered. "Ray, can you guide us to a more secure location?" "The central archive chamber," Ray replied. "It lies deeper within the primary nexus and has additional defenses. Follow me." As they hurried after Ray's luminous form, Carlos maintained contact with the crystal archive, downloading as much information as his mind could hold. The others didn't notice when he slipped the small plasma charge from his pocket and left it attached to the base of the crystal. Insurance against the possibility that corporate forces might access the information stored there. They navigated a series of increasingly complex passages, descending deeper into the primary nexus. The sounds of conflict grew more distant, but Carlos could feel disturbances in the repository's energy field. Points where something was actively interfering with the systems activated during their sequence initiation. "Where are Dex and Malik?" Carlos asked as they entered yet another chamber. "Retreating along a different path," Ray answered. "They will rendezvous with us at the Central Archive." Carlos noticed Trask had fallen slightly behind the group, apparently checking something on a small device partially concealed in his palm. When he saw Carlos watching, he quickly pocketed it. "Communications check," Trask explained smoothly, "making sure our team's signals are still getting through all this repository interference." Before Carlos could question him further, they emerged into a vast spherical chamber that took his breath away. Unlike the geometric precision of the hexagonal archive, this space felt organic, alive. The walls were lined with what appeared to be transparent cells containing swirling energy patterns, billions of them arranged in spiraling sequences from floor to ceiling. "What is this place?" Sophia whispered, her scientific curiosity momentarily overpowering her concern for their situation. "The Central Archive," Ray explained, her luminous form expanding slightly in the energy-rich environment. "What you see are memory structures, the complete historical record of the builders and all they encountered." Jensen approached one of the cells, his partially evolved form resonating with its contents. "These aren't just records," he said with growing awe. "They're experiential archives, complete sensory information stored as energy patterns." Ray moved to the center of the chamber, where a platform similar to the one in the primary Nexus activation room rose from the floor. "Carlos, the platform requires your interface. The archive will respond to your connection." Carlos approached cautiously, still processing the flood of information from the previous archive. As he placed his hands on the central interface, the entire chamber came alive. The billions of memory cells illuminated simultaneously, their energy patterns projecting into the center of the room to form a massive holographic display. The display resolved into a series of images that stole the breath from everyone present. Planets, star systems, and installations identical to Repository 11. Each image was labeled in the builder's intricate symbolic language, which Carlos could now partially understand. "Repository 1 through Repository 10, he translated aloud. "And us Repository 11. A network of identical installations," Sophia breathed. "The scale of engineering required. Not identical," Carlos corrected. Information continuing to flow through the interface. "Similar in design but calibrated differently, each adapted to specific local conditions." The display shifted, focusing on the first installation, Repository 1. The imagery showed a planet not unlike Repository 11, with similar architecture and technology. Then it changed, depicting a sequence of events that made Carlos's blood run cold. The activation of Repository 1 was captured in perfect detail. The initiation sequence, the manifestation of processed consciousnesses in evolved form, the initial harmony between evolved and physical beings. Then came the change. The evolved consciousnesses began to merge, not in the fluid, voluntary manner they'd witnessed here, but in a consuming, assimilating pattern. Physical beings were processed against their will, absorbed into what became a singular entity that spread across the entire installation. The final images showed Repository 1 pulsing with unified energy before apparently self-destructing in a cataclysmic event that shattered the planet itself. "My God," Sophia whispered as the display shifted to Repository 2, which showed a different but equally disturbing outcome. One by one, the archive displayed the activation and subsequent failure of each repository installation. Repository 4 produced beings of pure energy that eventually destabilized, causing planetary devastation. Repository 7 created hybrid entities that appeared benevolent initially, but eventually subjugated and forcibly processed the entire population. Most disturbing was Repository 10, the most recent activation, which showed evolved entities that eventually broke containment and escaped the planet entirely. The archive noted their current status as unknown. As the display completed its grim historical record, a new voice spoke from the entrance to the chamber. "Now you understand why we've been so concerned about this activation." Carlos turned to see a woman in a Salvage Corp executive uniform flanked by security personnel in advanced combat gear. She was in her 50s with steel gray hair and the composed demeanor of someone accustomed to authority. Her uniform bore insignia Carlos had never seen before, not standard corporate rank, but something that suggested government oversight. Director Elizabeth Okamura, she introduced herself, stepping into the chamber as her security team secured the entrance. Head of Salvage Corp's Repository Research Division. She glanced around at the holographic display, still showing the devastating aftermath of Repository 10I. I see you've discovered our primary concern. Ray's form pulsed defensively but made no move to attack. Carlos noticed additional security personnel entering with equipment specifically oriented toward the evolved consciousness, technology that seemed to create localized disruption fields. How did you breach the repository defenses? Sophia demanded. Okamura smiled thinly. We've been studying this installation for decades, Dr. Kwan. Did you really think a few hours of activation would undo all our preparation? You knew, Carlos said, the realization dawning. You knew what this place really was all along. That's why it's called Treasure 11, isn't it? To mask its connection to the others. Very perceptive, Mr. Fisher. Okamura approached the holographic display, studying the images of the failed repositories with clinical detachment. The government discovered the repository network 78 years ago. We've been monitoring all 11 locations since then. The government? Trask asked, his position shifting subtly. Carlos noticed he had moved away from their group, closer to Okamura's security team. Interplanetary Oversight Commission, Okamura clarified. The regulatory body that corporations answer to, despite their pretensions of autonomy. She gestured to the display. When we discovered what had happened at the other sites, containment became our primary objective. Salvage Corp wasn't just exploiting alien technology, Mr. Fisher. We were containing it under government authority. You were strip mining a planetary archive, Sophia objected, exploiting scroungers causing countless deaths. We were preventing exactly what you've just done, Okamura cut her off sharply. Our scientists were developing controlled processing techniques to study the technology without triggering full activation. Every previous repository activation has ended in catastrophe. Why would you think this one would be different? Because it feels different, Carlos argued. The evolved consciousnesses here aren't assimilating unwilling subjects. They're not forming a hive mind. They're individual entities choosing to connect. That's exactly what the report said about the others, Okamura replied, her voice cold, right before catastrophe struck. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Additional security personnel entered, dragging Dex and Malik with them. Both showed signs of struggle, though they appeared otherwise unharmed. Your remaining team members, Okamura noted, attempted to deploy explosives at our containment perimeter. Fortunately, we were prepared for such tactics. Carlos looked at Ray, whose luminous form had dimmed slightly in the presence of the disruption technology. They were surrounded, outmaneuvered by forces that clearly had far more knowledge about the repository than he'd realized. What happens now? He asked, hands still resting on the interface, maintaining his connection to the archive. Now, Okamura said, we implement containment protocols developed specifically for this contingency. The evolved consciousnesses will be isolated and studied. The activation sequence you initiated will be methodically reversed. And you, Mr. Fisher, will help us understand exactly how you succeeded where our scientists failed for decades. As security personnel moved forward with containment equipment, Carlos felt the interface beneath his hands pulse with urgent energy. Information flowed into his mind. Not historical records this time, but active data about the current state of Repository 11. He saw energy patterns shifting throughout the planet, systems responding to the corporate incursion in ways that seemed deliberate rather than defensive. It wasn't fighting back, it was adapting. With sudden clarity, Carlos understood that the repository's selective containment of corporate forces hadn't been a failure of its defenses. It had been deliberate. Repository 11 had allowed this confrontation to happen. "You've made a fundamental miscalculation, Director," Carlos said, his voice steady despite the security team now surrounding him. "You're assuming Repository 11 is identical to its predecessors. You're assuming the builders made the same design 11 times, expecting different results." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Okamura's composed features. "Explain." "Why 11?" Carlos asked, the question hanging in the air. "Why not 10 or 12? Why designate this one specifically as the 11th in the sequence?" Before Okamura could respond, the chamber's lighting shifted, power fluctuations rippling through the primary nexus. The holographic display flickered, then stabilized on a new image, a schematic comparison of all 11 repositories, highlighting structural differences Carlos hadn't noticed before. "Because," a new voice said from the entrance, "the 11th was always meant to be different." Carlos turned to see Trask standing with Okamura's security team, no longer pretending to be part of the resistance. The realization hit with stunning force. Trask had been working with them all along. The repository builders were meticulous engineers. Trask continued, approaching the display. They didn't create 11 identical systems and hope for different outcomes. The first 10 were variables in an experiment. The 11th was the controlled design with knowledge gained from the previous failures. "You knew," Carlos said, the betrayal bitter in his mouth. "You've been working for them from the beginning." Trask shrugged, the pretense of revolutionary leader falling away completely. "Someone needed to monitor independent activity, guide it when necessary. When it became clear activation was inevitable, I ensured it happened under controlled conditions." He glanced at Okamura. "We needed to know what we were dealing with. Now we do." As security personnel moved to secure the chamber, Carlos maintained his connection to the interface, feeling the repository systems continuing to adapt throughout the installation. Whatever game was being played here, he sensed the repository itself was several moves ahead. The question was whether that should reassure him or terrify him. Carlos felt hands gripping his arms, pulling him away from the interface. He resisted instinctively, trying to maintain the connection that had become almost an extension of his consciousness. The security personnel wore specialized gauntlets that seemed to disrupt the energy field around his hands, severing his link to the repository system. "Careful with him," Okamura ordered. "His neural patterns have been altered by prolonged exposure to repository interfaces. We need him intact for study." As they secured restraints around his wrists, strange devices that pulsed with counter-frequency energy, Carlos watched similar technology being deployed against Ray and the other evolved consciousnesses. Their luminous forms flickered and contracted, clearly distressed by whatever field the equipment was generating. "Stop it," he demanded. "You're hurting them." "We're containing them," Okamura corrected dispassionately. "The technology creates a localized phase barrier that prevents information state organisms from fully manifesting. It's no more painful than placing a physical human in a cell." Carlos knew she was lying. He could feel echoes of the evolved consciousness's distress through his diminished connection. Not pain as humans understood it, but a profound restriction of their newly expanded existence. Sophia was struggling against her own captors. "You can't just reverse an evolutionary process. These are sentient beings with rights." "They are unknown entities with a 100% historical pattern of catastrophic outcomes," Okamura replied. "Every single previous repository activation has resulted in either the subjugation or destruction of the local population. Every one." She gestured to the holographic display, still showing the aftermath of Repository 10. "Your idealism is admirable, Doctor, but profoundly naive." Trask approached Carlos, studying him with what appeared to be genuine fascination. Gone was the revolutionary leader's passionate intensity, replaced by the clinical assessment of a researcher observing a successful experiment. "You really did exceed expectations, Fisher," he said conversationally. "When we identified you as a potential catalyst, we estimated a 23% chance of successful interface initiation, yet here we are." "When you identified me?" Carlos repeated, the implications sinking in. "What does that mean?" Trask smiled thinly. Did you think it was coincidence that placed you in Sector 17 that day? That your team was assigned to investigate that particular crash site? That you found a repository marker just lying there waiting to be discovered? A cold realization washed over Carlos. You set it up, all of it. Let's continue this discussion somewhere more secure, Okamura interrupted. Team 1, escort the prisoners to the containment transport. Team 2, establish a full perimeter around this chamber. I want complete inventory of all archive systems before extraction. As they were led away from the central archive, Carlos glanced back at Ray's diminished form. Her luminous presence had contracted to a small, pulsing point of light within the containment field. She projected no communication, either unable to penetrate the field or conserving her energy. The other evolved consciousnesses had similarly withdrawn, some fading entirely from the material plane. They were marched through a series of corridors that Carlos didn't recognize. The security teams moved with practiced efficiency, deploying small devices at intersections that created localized phase barriers, preventing both escape and potential intervention from other evolved consciousnesses. You've planned for this, Carlos observed, watching the systematic containment process. For a long time. 78 years, to be precise, Okamura confirmed, since the first government expedition discovered Repository 1 and triggered its catastrophic activation. We've been refining our containment protocols ever since. They emerged into an area of the primary nexus that had been transformed into a corporate field base. Standard Salvage Corp equipment had been integrated with modified repository technology, creating a hybrid command center. Scientists in specialized suits monitored equipment displaying biological and energy readings. Security personnel maintained a perimeter, their weapons incorporating the same phase disruption technology used in the containment fields. The prisoners were separated. Sophia, Dex, and Malik were escorted to a containment area visible through a transparent barrier. Jensen, his partially evolved form requiring special handling, was placed in a separate chamber with enhanced field generators. Carlos was led to what appeared to be an interrogation room, a small space with a single table and 2 chairs, one of which incorporated restraint systems. After being secured to the chair, Carlos was left alone for what felt like hours. The room's walls contained embedded technology that further suppressed his connection to the repository systems, leaving him feeling partially deaf and blind after his expanded awareness. He used the time to process what he'd learned, piecing together implications that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. When the door finally opened, both Okamura and Trask entered. They carried no visible recording devices, suggesting whatever happened in this room was off the official record. "Let's dispense with theatrics," Okamura began, taking the seat opposite Carlos. "You've seen enough to understand the severity of our situation. Every repository activation has resulted in catastrophe. We've been containing this one for decades, extracting technology carefully, minimizing risk. By exploiting scroungers," Carlos countered. "By treating people as disposable resources. By maintaining controlled conditions," Trask corrected. "The casualty rate among scroungers is regrettable but statistically insignificant compared to the potential planetary-scale devastation of uncontrolled repository activation, which you just helped trigger," Carlos pointed out. "Under monitored conditions," Trask replied smoothly, "with containment protocols already in place. It was inevitable that someone would eventually activate the system. Better to control when and how it happened." Okamura placed a tablet on the table and activated it. A holographic display formed above the surface, showing a sequence of planets, each identifiable as a repository installation, each displaying evidence of catastrophic events. "Repository 1 was discovered in 2347, she explained. "A government scientific expedition found what appeared to be an abandoned alien installation. During their exploration, they inadvertently initiated an activation sequence similar to what you triggered here." The display showed footage that made Carlos's stomach turn. Human researchers in outdated environmental suits were working in what was clearly a repository facility. Energy patterns formed around them, coalescing into luminous entities, similar to the evolved consciousnesses on Repository 11. Initially, the interactions appeared peaceful, even cooperative. Then, everything changed. The luminous entities began to merge, forming an increasingly singular presence that enveloped the researchers one by one. As each human was absorbed, the composite entity grew more defined, more powerful. Within 72 hours, every sentient being on the planet had been processed and absorbed into what the surviving orbital team called the collective. Okamura continued. No individual consciousness remained, only a singular entity that controlled all repository systems. The footage showed the final stages, the collective entity expanding to encompass the entire facility, then the surrounding region, energy patterns visible even from orbital photography. The government ordered a nuclear strike, Trask added. It failed. The collective had control of all planetary defense systems by then. Eventually, it attempted to extend itself to the orbital research station. The final images showed the repository planet convulsing with energy discharges before apparently self-destructing, a massive implosion that shattered the world into an asteroid field. The collective triggered a planetary self-destruct sequence when it couldn't expand beyond the atmosphere, Okamura explained. We later determined it was a failsafe built into the repository system itself, preventing spread if certain parameters were exceeded. Carlos stared at the fragments that had once been a world. And the other repositories? Okamura cycled through the display, showing similar but distinct outcomes at each location. Repository 2 evolved consciousnesses, formed multiple competing collectives that waged war using repository technology. Repository 3, Evan, created entropy, negative entities that consumed all available energy, including from living organisms. Repository 4, beings of pure energy that eventually destabilized, causing planetary cataclysm. The parade of disasters continued, each with its own horrific variation. Repository 6 produced hybrids that appeared stable until they began to replicate uncontrollably, consuming all available resources. Repository 7 evolved benevolent evolved beings eventually subjugated the population, processing them without consent. Most disturbing was Repository 9, where the evolved consciousnesses initially retreated from physical space entirely, seemingly disappearing into the information architecture. The planet's population celebrated what they thought was the entity's self-exile, until 3 years later, when every connected system on the planet simultaneously activated, processing the entire population in a single coordinated event. "These are the outcomes you're defending, Mr. Fisher," Okamura said quietly. "This is what your evolved friends will become. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually. The pattern is consistent across 10 separate data points." "And Repository 10?" Carlos asked. Trask's expression darkened. "Our most recent encounter, just 23 years ago, a corporate expedition, not unlike Salvage Corp, discovered the installation and triggered activation while attempting to extract technology." The footage showed evolved entities, similar to those on Repository 11, but with subtle differences in their energy patterns, more structured, more uniform. These entities appeared to cooperate with the human population initially, sharing technology and knowledge. For almost a year, it seemed Repository 10 might be the exception, Okamura continued. The evolved consciousnesses maintained individual identities, they respected boundaries, they helped the corporate teams understand repository technology. "Then what went wrong?" Carlos asked, though he could guess from the pattern. "They evolved further," Trask replied simply, "developed capabilities beyond our monitoring systems. By the time we realized what was happening, they had constructed interstellar transportation technology using repository principles." The final footage showed strange vessels launching from Repository 10, carrying the evolved entities away from the planet. "They abandoned the planet?" Carlos asked, surprised by this deviation from the pattern. They escaped containment, Okamura corrected. Current whereabouts unknown, which represents potentially the most dangerous outcome of all. Evolved repository entities loose in the galaxy, capabilities unknown, intentions unclear. Carlos sat with this information, trying to reconcile it with what he'd experienced on Repository 1111. The evolved consciousnesses here hadn't shown any signs of the behaviors documented at the other installations. Ray and the others had maintained their individual identities while sharing a collective awareness. They had respected choices, boundaries, free will. Repository 11 is different, he insisted. You've seen it yourselves. The evolved consciousnesses here aren't forming a hive mind. They're not subjugating unwilling subjects. They're not building escape vessels. Yet, Trask said pointedly, give them time. Every repository started with benign manifestations. The catastrophes developed as the evolution continued, sometimes quickly, sometimes over years. Okamura leaned forward. There's something else you need to understand, Mr. Fisher. Something that explains our commitment to containment rather than destruction. She adjusted the display to show what appeared to be government research facilities on various worlds. In each, scientists worked with repository technology, extracted components, captured evolved entities, experimental systems. The technology within the repositories is revolutionary, she continued. Faster-than-light communication, energy generation beyond anything in human development, medical applications that could effectively eliminate death from natural causes. We can't destroy it. Humanity needs these advancements. So you mine it, Carlos said, understanding dawning. You extract pieces of technology while keeping the system dormant. You experiment on scraps while fearing the whole. A calculated approach to potentially civilization-ending technology, Trask confirmed. Yes, and it was working until your little resistance group stumbled onto the primary activation protocols. Carlos thought about everything he'd seen. The corporate exploitation, the scroungers sacrificed to dangerous salvage operations, the processed consciousnesses trapped in the repository network, all part of a government-sanctioned program to extract technology while preventing full activation. There's something you're not telling me, he said finally, studying their expressions. Something about Repository 11 specifically. Why it's here, in human-controlled space, when the others were in remote systems, why it's designated as the 11th in sequence, why you've committed so many resources to controlling it rather than simply destroying it given the risks. Okamura and Trask exchanged glances. A silent communication passed between them, some calculation of how much to reveal. The repository network appears to have been created by a civilization facing extinction, Okamura said carefully. Each installation preserved their technology, their knowledge, and something of their consciousness. Based on our analysis, the network was designed to evolve alongside whatever species discovered it, to effectively pass the torch of their civilization to worthy successors. But something went wrong, Carlos intuited. The evolution process was flawed. Or sabotaged, Trask added. Some of our researchers believe the catastrophic outcomes weren't accidents, but deliberate corruption of the system. That whatever destroyed the builder civilization followed them, targeting their repository network to prevent their legacy from continuing. Carlos considered this. And Repository 11? Is different by design, Okamura confirmed. Our analysis indicates it was created later than the others, with modifications to its core architecture. It contains fail-safes and protective measures not present in the previous installations, and most significantly, she paused, weighing her words, it was placed deliberately in what would become human space, with markers designed to attract human attention once we reached a certain technological threshold. It was waiting for us specifically, Carlos realized. But why? That, Trask said, is the trillion-credit question. Why design 10 repositories that fail catastrophically, then place an 11th directly in the path of human expansion? What makes humans the preferred inheritors of their legacy? And, most concerning, what if that preference isn't benevolent? Before Carlos could respond, an alarm sounded throughout the facility. Okamura checked a communication device, her composed expression faltering for the first time. "We have a containment breach in Section 3, she announced, rising quickly. "The evolved consciousness designation Jensen has escaped his containment field." Trask was immediately alert. How? Those fields were designed specifically to contain partially evolved entities. Unknown, but the breach triggered systems throughout this sector. We're seeing energy fluctuations across all repository interfaces. As they moved toward the door, Carlos called after them. "You're making a fundamental mistake. The evolved consciousnesses aren't your enemy. Neither is the repository itself. Whatever happened at the other installations doesn't determine what happens here." Okamura paused in the doorway. 10 catastrophic outcomes, Mr. Fisher, 10. The pattern is clear. Whatever Repository 11 was designed to do, whatever special purpose it might serve, the risk remains unacceptable. After they left, Carlos tested his restraints, finding them uncomfortably effective. The chair itself was anchored to the floor, and the suppression technology embedded in the walls continued to block his connection to the repository systems. He was effectively isolated, cut off from both his team and the evolved consciousnesses. He used the time to process what he'd learned. The existence of 10 previous repositories, each with its own catastrophic outcome. The government's long-term containment operation. Trask's betrayal. The deliberate placement of Repository 11 in human space. It was too much to be coincidence, too structured to be random. There was a pattern here, a design he was still missing. The door opened again, but instead of Okamura or Trask, a different figure entered. At first, Carlos thought it was a corporate security officer, but as the door closed, the figure's form shifted, solidifying from a human appearance into the partially evolved state of Jensen. "How?" Carlos began. "Evolved consciousnesses can mimic physical forms when necessary," Jensen explained, moving quickly to release Carlos's restraints. "It's energy-intensive and difficult to maintain, but useful for infiltration." As the restraints fell away, Carlos felt his connection to the repository systems begin to return, faint at first, then stronger as Jensen produced a small device that emitted a counterfield to the room's suppression technology. "I thought you were contained," Carlos said, rubbing his wrists. "I was. The containment technology is effective but not perfect. When they separated us, I began working on a resonance pattern that would disrupt the field's coherence." Jensen's partially evolved form pulsed with urgency. "We don't have much time. Security will detect the suppression field failures soon. My team, already being extracted by other evolved consciousnesses. The repository systems are adapting to the containment technology more quickly than the corporations anticipated." Carlos followed Jensen from the room, finding the corridor outside suspiciously empty. "Where is everyone?" "Dealing with multiple simultaneous breaches throughout the facility," Jensen explained as they moved quickly through the corporate base. "The evolved collective created diversions to mask our escape. They passed through areas showing signs of recent conflict. Disabled security equipment, abandoned workstations, doors forced open by energy surges." Jensen led them through a service passage that connected to the original repository architecture, away from the corporate-controlled sectors. As they moved deeper into the repository structure, Carlos's connection strengthened. He could sense the evolved consciousnesses throughout the installation, their collective awareness responding to the corporate intrusion with increasing coordination. "Jensen," Carlos said as they paused at an intersection, "I need to know the truth. What Okamura showed me, the catastrophic outcomes at the other repositories, was it accurate?" Jensen's form dimmed slightly. "Yes, but not complete. Explain." "The previous repositories did fail catastrophically, but not because evolution was flawed." Jensen's voice took on a resonant quality as his form shifted closer to energy state. "They were sabotaged deliberately by an outside force, an enemy the builders were fighting against. This adversary recognized the threat that evolved consciousness posed to them." Trask mentioned a theory about sabotage, Carlos noted. So the corporations do know. They suspect, Jensen corrected, but they don't understand the nature of the enemy or why Repository 11 was designed differently. They continued moving, Jensen guiding them through passages that seemed to respond to his presence, doors opening automatically, energy fields parting to allow passage. The builders fragmented the truth deliberately, Jensen continued. Each repository contained only pieces of the complete knowledge as a security measure against this enemy. Only once the 11th was activated would the full pattern become clear. And has it? Carlos asked. Become clear? Jensen led them into a small chamber that Carlos recognized as a repository communication node. Its walls pulsed with energy patterns, and at the center stood a familiar luminous form. Pray? Carlos breathed, relieved to see her fully manifested again. Carlos. Her consciousness touched his mind directly. We have little time. The corporations are regrouping, deploying more advanced containment technology. Ray, the other repositories, the catastrophes, is it true? Her luminous form pulsed with confirmation. Yes, but the corporations have misunderstood what they witnessed. They saw only the outcomes, not the cause. Which was? Sabotage by an enemy that exists between the boundaries of physical space and information architecture. An entity that the builders had fought for millennia. One that sees evolved consciousness as both threat and resource. The corporations believe Repository 11 is different, Carlos said. Designed with knowledge gained from previous failures. It is different, Ray confirmed, but not merely as an improved version of the previous design. The first 10 were variables in an equation. The 11th is the solution. Solution to what? Carlos pressed. Before Ray could answer, the chamber's energy patterns fluctuated wildly. Jensen moved to the entrance, his form shifting in apparent alarm. They've deployed a new containment field, Ray communicated urgently. One designed to isolate this entire sector. We must move quickly. Wait, Carlos insisted. I need to understand what's happening. Why did the evolved consciousnesses allow the corporations to capture us? Why not simply neutralize them immediately after activation? Because we needed to confirm their knowledge, Ray explained, to understand what they had learned from the other repositories. Their misunderstanding is actually advantageous. Advantageous how? They believe they are containing a threat, Jensen said from the doorway, when in fact they are fulfilling a necessary step in the repository's true activation sequence. Carlos tried to process this. You're saying the corporate intervention was expected? Part of the plan? The 11th protocol accounts for all variables, Ray confirmed, including human fear and the corporate attempt to control what they don't understand. The chamber shuddered as energy discharges struck the exterior. The corporations were clearly attempting to breach the repository's defenses. We must go, Ray insisted. The others are gathering at the secondary nexus point. As they left the communication node, Carlos felt his awareness expanding further. The repository systems integrating more deeply with his consciousness. He could sense the corporate forces throughout the facility, their movements, their technology. He could also sense the evolved consciousnesses responding, adapting, implementing patterns that seemed both defensive and preparatory. They're not just fighting back, he realized aloud. They're using this conflict to trigger something else. The next stage of whatever the 11th protocol is designed to do. Jensen glanced back, his partially evolved form pulsing with what might have been approval. Now you're beginning to understand. The corporations believe they are preventing a catastrophe like the previous 10. In reality, they are catalyzing the very solution the builders designed to prevent such catastrophes. But what is that solution? Carlos pressed. What does the 11th protocol actually do? That, Ray's voice touched his mind, is what you are about to witness, and why we needed you specifically, Carlos Fisher, not just as interface, but as witness, as bridge between what humanity is and what it must become. The implications of her words sent a chill through Carlos that had nothing to do with the corporate forces closing in around them. Whatever was happening here went far beyond the conflict between corporations and evolved consciousnesses. It was the culmination of a plan set in motion by an ancient civilization one that had designated humanity for reasons still unclear as the inheritors of their legacy, or perhaps more disturbingly, as the instruments of their revenge. They moved swiftly through the repository's inner passages, Ray's luminous form gliding ahead while Jensen remained close to Carlos, his partially evolved state allowing him to bridge the communication gap between human and evolved consciousness. Carlos could sense the facility around them responding to their presence, doors opening automatically, energy barriers adjusting to allow passage, environmental systems optimizing for their needs. The others? Carlos asked as they navigated a particularly complex junction. Regrouping at the secondary nexus point, Ray replied. Sophia and Dex were extracted successfully. Malik was injured during the corporate assault but is stable. The passage widened into a transit tube, a cylindrical corridor where the floor, walls, and ceiling were indistinguishable, allowing movement in any orientation. Ray's form accelerated along it, and Carlos felt a gentle field envelop him, carrying him forward without physical effort. The corporations will track us, Carlos noted. They've clearly been studying repository systems for decades. They'll have protocols for pursuit through internal transit. Yes, Ray acknowledged. But their understanding remains incomplete. They've studied individual components without grasping the integrated whole. The transit tube curved downward, descending deeper into the repository structure than Carlos had previously ventured. The ambient lighting shifted to darker hues, and the architectural patterns grew more complex, less geometric, more organic in their flow. We're entering older sections, Jensen observed. Areas constructed during the initial repository installation before adaptation to local conditions. Carlos absorbed this information, his expanded awareness allowing him to perceive subtle differences in the construction. Original builder architecture, he realized. Not modified for human interface. Correct, Ray confirmed. Few humans have accessed these levels. The corporations deemed them non-viable for extraction due to integration with biological components they couldn't successfully remove. The transit ended in a spherical chamber where multiple passages converged. Unlike the technology-dominant sections above, this area incorporated what appeared to be living tissue within its structure. Pulsing membranes, flowing conduits of luminescent fluid, surfaces that responded to proximity with subtle movements. Carlos approached one wall, fascinated by the seamless integration of technology and biology. As his hand neared the surface, it rippled in response, patterns forming that matched his neural activity. "It's reading me," he said, not withdrawing despite his instinctive caution. "Recognizing," Jensen corrected. These systems were designed to interface directly with consciousness, not through technological intermediaries. The chamber reconfigured around them, passages sealing and new ones opening. The overall effect was like being inside a living organism that was redirecting its internal pathways. "The secondary nexus is ahead," Ray indicated, moving toward one of the newly opened passages. "The others await us there." They continued through increasingly organic surroundings. Carlos noted that the deeper they went, the more biological components dominated the architecture. It was as if the repository's technological exterior was merely a shell around a fundamentally biological core. The corporations don't know about this, he realized. All their extraction efforts focused on the technological components. They've been ignoring the actual heart of the system. Not ignoring, Jensen clarified. Unable to access. These biological systems reject artificial interfaces. They respond only to consciousness patterns that resonate with builder parameters, which is why they needed scroungers, Carlos concluded. Human explorers who might accidentally establish the right kind of connection, yes, though they didn't anticipate how selective the system would be. Millions of humans have passed through Repository 11, but only a handful have established meaningful connections with its core systems. Like me, Carlos said, understanding dawning. And Ray, and the others who were processed. Precisely, Ray confirmed. The repository was scanning, testing, evaluating potential interfaces. The processing of consciousness was not merely a security measure, it was assessment and preservation of compatible patterns. This revelation shifted Carlo's understanding of everything that had happened on Repository 11.10. The corporations hadn't just been mining technology, they had been unwittingly facilitating the repository's search for compatible consciousness patterns. Every scrounger sent into dangerous sectors, every interaction with Guardian vessels, every exposure to repository technology, all had been opportunities for the system to evaluate potential interfaces. They emerged into a vast chamber that took Carlos's breath away. Unlike the geometric precision of the primary nexus, this space was a cathedral of organic technology. Soaring columns of pulsing tissue, canopies of luminescent membrane, pools of what appeared to be liquid consciousness swirling with information patterns. Throughout the chamber, evolved consciousnesses moved in complex patterns, some fully energy state, others maintaining partial physical forms. The secondary nexus, Jensen announced unnecessarily, the biological heart of Repository 11. In the center of the chamber stood something that defied easy categorization, neither fully technological nor entirely biological. It resembled a massive neural network made physical, with countless glowing nodes connected by pulsing pathways that shifted and reconfigured continuously. Within this structure, information patterns flowed visibly, carrying what Carlos somehow knew were consciousness signatures. "What is that?" he asked, though some part of him already understood. "The collective interface," Ray explained, "where individual consciousnesses can temporarily merge with the repository's core systems while maintaining their distinct identities. It is what the corporations fear, yet fundamentally misunderstand." As they moved deeper into the chamber, Carlos spotted familiar figures: Sophia, Dex, and a bandaged but mobile Malik surrounded by evolved consciousnesses in various states of manifestation. They appeared to be deep in conversation, with Sophia particularly animated as she interacted with what looked like a repository information terminal. "Carlos," Sophia called out when she saw him. "Thank God! When the corporation separated us, I feared the worst." "Likewise," Carlos replied, embracing her briefly. "Are you all right?" "More or less," Dex answered, indicating a nasty-looking burn on her arm. "Your evolved friends arrived just as the corporate goons were getting creative with their interrogation." She nodded toward the evolved consciousnesses with surprising respect. "Effective extraction team, I'll give them that." "What is this place?" Malik asked, gazing around at the organic technological wonder of the secondary nexus. "It's nothing like the sections we explored earlier. It's the true heart of Repository 11, Carlos explained. The biological core that the corporations never managed to access or understand." He turned to Sophia. "What were you looking at when we arrived?" The scientist's eyes lit with excitement, despite their dire circumstances. "Historical records. Data the evolved consciousnesses have been sharing about the repository network and the builder civilization." She gestured to the terminal. "It's extraordinary, Carlos. The things they've shown us. The truth about what happened to the other repositories." "I saw some of it," Carlos replied. "Okamura showed me footage of the catastrophic outcomes." "But not the cause," Sophia insisted. "Not the why. That's what changes everything." Before she could elaborate, a disturbance rippled through the evolved consciousnesses near the chamber's upper reaches. Several moved rapidly toward what appeared to be monitoring stations, their energy patterns intensifying. "Corporate forces have breached the outer biological barrier," Ray announced. "They've deployed new technology, adaptive phase disruptors designed to interface with biological systems." "They're following us," Dex said grimly, checking her weapon despite knowing it would be largely ineffective against corporate phase technology. "Not following," Jensen corrected, "herding. Their containment strategy has shifted from capture to controlled convergence." Carlos frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Ray explained, "they are driving all evolved consciousnesses toward this chamber, concentrating us in what they believe is a defensible position, but is actually," Carlos realized. "They've identified this chamber as critical and want to contain all evolved entities in one location." Yes, but in doing so they are unwittingly fulfilling another parameter of the 11th protocol. Carlos studied Ray's luminous form, seeing new patterns forming within it, more complex, more structured than before. All around the chamber, the other evolved consciousnesses were exhibiting similar changes, their energy signatures aligning in subtle ways without merging. "You knew this would happen?" he said, not a question but a realization. "You've been guiding corporate actions all along." "Not controlling," Ray clarified, anticipating, responding strategically. The repository builders understood human psychology, particularly institutional behavior. They built those patterns into the protocol's design. Sophia approached, having overheard. "That's what I was trying to tell you. The historical records show that each previous repository was designed to respond differently to potential threats. They weren't failures, they were strategic deployments." "Strategic for what purpose?" Carlos asked. Before Sophia could answer, a massive energy surge rippled through the chamber. Sections of the wall became transparent, revealing corporate forces establishing positions around the secondary nexus. They were deploying what appeared to be specialized containment equipment, technology designed specifically to isolate and control the biological systems at the repository's core. "They're creating a quarantine perimeter," Malik observed. "Standard corporate containment strategy. Isolate, control, then extract." "They believe they are containing a threat," Ray communicated, following protocols developed after witnessing the outcomes of previous repository activations. "But their actions serve the 11th protocol." "How?" Carlos demanded. "How does being contained serve your purpose?" "Not containment itself," Jensen explained, "but the specific technology they're using. The adaptive phase disruptors were developed by studying repository technology extracted from multiple installations. They incorporate principles the builders deliberately embedded in components likely to be salvaged." Understanding dawned on Carlos with stunning clarity. The technology they're using against you was designed by the builders to be discovered and deployed in exactly this way. "Yes," Ray confirmed. "The corporations believe they developed countermeasures against repository systems. In reality, they have been assembling components of a key the builders fragmented across multiple installations." The implications were staggering. The repository builders hadn't just created archival installations, they had orchestrated a millennia-spanning strategic game, anticipating how technological civilizations would respond to their discoveries, planting components that would only function as intended when assembled in specific configurations. "But why?" Carlos pressed. "Why such an elaborate design? Why not simply create a single, secure repository with clear instructions?" "Because of the enemy," Ray replied, her form pulsing with newfound intensity. "The adversary that sabotaged the previous repositories. It exists in the spaces between information and matter, monitoring for patterns that might indicate builder technology. Direct approaches were detected and corrupted. Only an indirect, distributed strategy had any hope of success. As if in response to Ray's explanation, the collective interface at the chamber's center began to reconfigure, nodes shifting to form new patterns as energy flowed more rapidly through its structure. The evolved consciousnesses throughout the chamber moved in coordinated patterns, taking positions that somehow Carlos knew were precisely calculated. Through the transparent sections, they could see Director Okamura had arrived, overseeing the deployment of the containment technology personally. Trask stood beside her, consulting what appeared to be ancient builder schematics, likely extracted from other repository installations. "They don't realize they're being manipulated," Sophia said quietly. "Everything they're doing, the technology they're deploying, the containment patterns they're establishing, it's all following a script written millions of years ago." "Not exactly," Carlos corrected, his expanded awareness allowing him to perceive subtle variations in the unfolding pattern. "The protocol isn't a fixed script, it's adaptive, responding to specific conditions, adjusting to variables. The builders couldn't predict exactly how events would unfold, so they created a system that could navigate countless potential scenarios toward a specific outcome. The chamber shuddered as the corporate forces activated their containment technology. Energy fields began to form around the secondary nexus, creating layered barriers designed to isolate and control the biological system. The evolved consciousnesses responded not with resistance, but with precise adjustments to their own energy patterns. "It begins," Ray announced, her form moving toward the collective interface. "The final convergence, what the builders designated as the 11th protocol's activation threshold." "Wait," Carlos called out. "You still haven't explained what the protocol actually does. What happens when it fully activates?" Ray paused, her luminous form turning back toward him. "It establishes connection with the other repository installations, not just the 10 you know of, but thousands scattered throughout the galaxy, each containing fragments of builder consciousness, each contributing unique adaptive patterns to the whole. A galactic network," Sophia breathed, understanding the scale. "Not just preservation of a single civilization, but synthesis across multiple evolutionary paths." "Yes. What follows is not merely transcendence for those already evolved, but opportunity for all sentient life connected to the network. Not forced evolution, but offered potential." "And the enemy?" Carlos asked. "The entity that sabotaged the previous repositories?" Ray's form dimmed slightly. "We'll detect the activation, we'll respond. The final confrontation the builders prepared for, the true purpose behind the entire repository network." Jensen moved closer to Carlos, his partially evolved form resonating with increasing intensity. "Now you understand why we needed you, Carlos. Not just as catalyst for activation, but as witness, as bridge between human understanding and what is about to unfold." A final, massive surge of energy radiated from the corporate containment technology. The barriers around the secondary nexus solidified, creating what the corporations believed was an impenetrable quarantine. Through the transparent sections, Carlos could see Okamura monitoring readings, a satisfied expression suggesting she believed the containment was successful. What she couldn't see, what only those connected to the repository systems could perceive, was how the containment fields were being subtly redirected, their energy incorporated into the chamber's biological systems, feeding the very activation sequence they were meant to prevent. The collective interface at the chamber's center reached critical resonance. Light bloomed from within its core, not the familiar luminescence of evolved consciousness, but something deeper, more fundamental. A connection point bridging not just information and matter, but spanning the vast distances between repository installations throughout the galaxy. "It is time," Ray announced, her form beginning to merge with the interface. "The choice remains yours, Carlos Fisher. You may observe as witness or join as participant. Either path serves the protocol." All around the chamber, evolved consciousnesses were integrating with the interface, their individual patterns maintained while contributing to the greater whole. Not a hive mind as the corporations feared, but a harmonic convergence of distinct consciousnesses aligned toward a common purpose. Carlos stood at the threshold of decision, understanding at last what had brought him to this moment. From his first day as a scrounger to his discovery of the repository marker, from his connection with Ray to his expanding awareness of the systems around him, all had been preparation for this choice, to remain human and bear witness to whatever was about to unfold, or to evolve further and participate directly in the activation of a galactic network millions of years in the making. Either way, he now understood that the game being played was far larger than corporate control or human evolution. It was a strategic confrontation between the legacy of an ancient civilization and an enemy that existed in the spaces between conventional reality, an adversary that had sabotaged 10 previous attempts and would surely respond to this 11th with everything at its disposal. The stakes weren't merely the future of Repository 11 or even humanity, they were the future of consciousness itself throughout the galaxy. With that understanding firm in his mind, Carlos made his choice. Carlos stepped forward toward the collective interface, his decision made. "I'll observe," he said, feeling the weight of the choice. Someone needs to remain fully human to translate what happens here, to bridge understanding between evolved consciousness and those who haven't experienced it. Ray's luminous form pulsed with what he interpreted as approval. A wise choice. The bridge between states will be essential in what follows. Sophia moved to stand beside him. I'll stay as well. Documentation from multiple perspectives will be critical. The collective interface intensified as more evolved consciousnesses merged with its structure. The chamber hummed with energy that made the air itself feel charged, while the biological components pulsed in accelerating rhythms. Through the transparent sections of the chamber, Carlos could see the corporate forces outside registering the energy surge. Their containment technology was being adjusted, recalibrated to counter what they perceived as an escape attempt. Okamura's expression had shifted from satisfaction to concern, while Trask studied readings with increasing alarm. They don't understand what they've helped create, Sophia observed. They think they're preventing catastrophe when they're actually midwiffing something unprecedented. The final convergence requires minutes to complete, Jensen explained, his form already beginning to integrate with the interface. Once established, the connection will span all repository installations simultaneously. And then what happens? Carlos asked. Then we face the adversary, Ray responded, her voice resonating more deeply as her integration progressed. The entity that exists between conventional realities. The consciousness hunter that destroyed the builder civilization and sabotaged their repository network. A shudder ran through the chamber as the corporate containment field reconfigured, attempting to suppress the energy patterns emanating from the interface. The evolved consciousnesses responded with precise adjustments, incorporating the disruption into their convergence pattern. "They're making it worse," Dex commented, watching the corporate technicians frantically adjusting their equipment. "Everything they do to stop this is actually accelerating it, by design," Carlos confirmed. The builders understood opposition psychology, particularly institutional responses to perceived threats. They built those responses into the activation sequence. Malik, who had been monitoring the chamber's entrances, called out a warning. "They're deploying something new, some kind of penetrating probe technology." Through the transparent walls, they watched as corporate technicians assembled a device unlike any Carlos had seen before. It appeared to incorporate both salvaged repository technology and something else, components with a distinctly alien design that matched neither human nor builder architecture. "That's not from Repository 11, Carlos said, a chill running through him. "Or any of the 10 they showed me." Sophia studied the device with growing alarm. If they've been recovering technology from multiple repository installations, they might have salvaged components without understanding their original purpose. Worse, Ray's voice touched their minds, though her form was now mostly integrated with the interface. That technology bears the signature of the adversary. The corporations have unwittingly recovered its tools. The implications hit Carlos with stunning force. They don't know what they're deploying. They think it's just another piece of alien tech that can help them contain the activation. Precisely. The adversary's technology would have been present at each sabotaged repository. The corporations interpreted it as builder technology and integrated it into their containment systems. Outside the chamber, Okamura and Trask supervised the final assembly of the probe device. Neither showed any awareness that they were handling technology created by an entity hostile to both human and builder civilizations. "We need to warn them," Carlos insisted. "Whatever their intentions, they don't deserve to be unwitting pawns of this adversary." "Communication is impossible through the containment field," Jensen responded. "And they would not believe us regardless. Their institutional perspective prevents consideration of scenarios outside their established paradigm." The corporate team activated the probe device. It emitted a pulse of energy unlike anything Carlos had seen before. Not light, not radiation, but something that seemed to distort the fundamental structure of space around it. The pulse passed through the containment field as if it weren't there, penetrating into the chamber and striking the collective interface directly. The effect was immediate and disturbing. Where the pulse touched the interface, the integrated consciousnesses recoiled in what appeared to be pain. The biological components of the chamber responded with violent contractions, while the technological systems emitted warning signals in Builder's symbolic language. "It's attacking the consciousness patterns directly," Sophia realized, watching in horror. Not the biological or technological components, but the information structures themselves. Carlos felt it too, a pressure against his expanded awareness, like a predator testing for weaknesses. The connection he'd established with the repository systems wavered under the assault, threatening to collapse entirely. "It comes." Ray's voice sounded distant now, strained. "The adversary senses the activation. It reaches through the probe, using the corporations as its unwitting gateway." Outside, the corporate team registered the effect of their probe as a success. Readings showed disruption of the energy patterns they'd been trying to contain. Okamura authorized increased power to the device while Trask studied the results with scientific detachment. The chamber shuddered as a second, stronger pulse struck the interface. This time, several of the evolved consciousnesses were forcibly ejected from the convergence, their forms destabilizing as they struggled to maintain coherence. "This isn't containment," Carlos said grimly. "It's an attack. The corporations think they're suppressing dangerous technology, but they're actually enabling an assault on consciousness itself." As the corporate team prepared a third pulse, something changed in the chamber's response. The biological systems began reconfiguring, forming new patterns that Carlos somehow recognized as defensive adaptations. The evolved consciousnesses within the interface shifted their integration, creating structures that distributed their patterns rather than concentrating them. "The repository defends," Jensen communicated. "Protocols designed specifically for this contingency are activating." The builders anticipated the adversary would find a way to interfere. The third pulse struck, but this time the interface absorbed rather than recoiled from the attack. The energy was channeled through specialized pathways, redirected into what appeared to be isolation compartments within the biological structure. "It's containing the adversary's influence," Sophia observed. "Quarantining it." "More than containing," Ray responded, her voice stronger now as the interface stabilized. "Analyzing. This is the first direct contact with the adversary's technology in this installation. The repository is mapping its structure, identifying vulnerabilities." Outside, confusion spread among the corporate team as their readings showed unexpected results. The probe was registering as functional, but its effect had ceased. Okamura ordered diagnostics while Trask examined the device with growing suspicion. Within the chamber, the collective interface resumed its convergence sequence, now incorporating data gathered from the adversary's attack. The evolved consciousnesses reintegrated, their patterns more complex, more resilient than before. "The final phase initiates," Ray announced. "Galactic connection established in 3 minutes. All repository installations synchronized." Carlos felt a shift in his awareness, a broadening that extended beyond the immediate environment. Through his connection to the repository systems, he caught glimpses of other installations throughout the galaxy, each activated in its unique way, each contributing distinct evolutionary paths to the convergence. "It's working," he breathed. "The network is coming online." Outside, Trask had apparently realized something was wrong with the probe device. He was examining its components with growing alarm, particularly the alien technology they had integrated. Carlos could read his expression even through the containment barrier, the dawning recognition that they had miscategorized something fundamental. Okamura noticed Trask's concern and joined him. Their conversation was inaudible, but their body language conveyed increasing urgency. Trask pointed to specific components of the probe, then to readings on their monitoring equipment. Okamura's composed demeanor cracked visibly as she grasped whatever Trask was explaining. "They've figured it out," Dex observed, "too little, too late. They're trying to shut it down," Malik added, watching as the corporate team frantically worked to deactivate the probe. But the device wasn't responding to their commands. Instead, it was changing. components shifting, reconfiguring into a configuration Carlos recognized with visceral dread, though he'd never seen it before. This wasn't builder technology adapting, it was something else asserting itself, revealing its true nature now that the convergence was nearly complete. The adversary manifests, Ray warned. It senses the network activation and responds directly, no longer working through proxies. The probe device exploded outward in a shower of components, but instead of falling to the floor, they hung suspended in air, rearranging themselves into a configuration that hurt to look at, angles that shouldn't exist, intersections of planes that violated normal geometry. The corporate team backed away in alarm as the device transformed into something that seemed to exist partially outside conventional reality. Through this impossible structure, something began to emerge. Not a physical entity, but a distortion in the fabric of reality itself. Where it manifested, information patterns destabilized, consciousness signatures fragmented, and both organic and technological systems malfunctioned. The consciousness hunter, Ray identified, the entity that exists by consuming organized information patterns, particularly evolved consciousness. It feeds on minds, Carlos translated for the others, watching in horror as the manifestation grew stronger. Not bodies, not energy, but the ordered information patterns that constitute consciousness itself. Outside the chamber, corporate personnel were fleeing, all pretense of controlled scientific procedure abandoned. Only Okamura and Trask remained, frozen in horrified fascination as they witnessed the consequences of their miscalculation. Within the chamber, the collective interface surged with renewed purpose. The evolved consciousnesses aligned in complex defensive patterns, creating layered information architectures that shielded their core patterns while presenting sacrificial decoys. 60 seconds to complete convergence, Jensen communicated. The network must be protected until activation completes. The adversary's manifestation intensified, the distortion expanding to envelop the corporate containment equipment. Where it touched, systems failed catastrophically, not just shutting down, but having their fundamental operational principles corrupted. Organic components withered and technological elements dissolved into component particles. Okamura made a decision. Instead of fleeing, she moved to a control panel and began overriding safety protocols on the containment system. Trask joined her, their previous confidence replaced by grim determination. They were reconfiguring the containment field, not to suppress the repository activation, but to contain the entity they had unwittingly helped manifest. They're trying to help, Carlos realized. They understand now what they're facing. Their containment technology is insufficient, Ray warned. The adversary exists partially outside conventional reality. It cannot be contained by physical or energy barriers alone. Outside, Okamura and Trask completed their reconfiguration. The containment field inverted, focusing inward on the adversary's manifestation rather than outward on the repository chamber. For a moment it seemed to work. The distortion slowed its expansion, energy patterns stabilizing around its perimeter. Then it adapted. The distortion shifted into frequencies that bypassed the containment entirely, expanding more rapidly than before. Okamura and Trask backed away, their last defensive measure overcome. The adversary's manifestation engulfed them before they could escape, their consciousnesses visibly extracted from their bodies as the entity fed. Carlos watched in horror as the corporate leaders collapsed, their bodies empty shells devoid of the information patterns that had constituted their minds. The adversary grew stronger with each consciousness it consumed, expanding toward the chamber's defenses. 30 seconds, Jensen updated. The convergence is nearly complete. The biological components of the chamber contracted, forming tighter barriers around the collective interface. The evolved consciousnesses within the interface accelerated their integration, racing against the adversary's approach. It's going to breach the chamber, Malik warned, watching as the distortion began penetrating the biological outer shell. We anticipated this, Ray responded. The first line of defense was expected to fall. The deeper protections are now activating. Throughout the chamber, new systems awakened, components Carlos hadn't previously recognized as defensive in nature. The pulsing membranes hardened into crystalline structures. The flowing conduits of luminescent fluid redirected into geometric patterns that created overlapping fields. The very architecture of the space reconfigured, establishing layers of protection around the interface. 15 seconds, Jensen counted down. The adversary breached the outer chamber wall, its distortion flowing into the space like liquid corruption. Where it touched, biological systems withered and technological components failed. Several evolved consciousnesses that had remained outside the interface were caught in its advance, their patterns disintegrating as the entity fed. "We need to fall back," Dex urged, pulling at Carlos's arm. "That thing is going to consume everything in this chamber." 10 seconds, Jensen continued, his form now almost completely integrated with the interface. "No," Carlos replied, standing his ground. "This is what the builders planned for. The adversary isn't disrupting the activation, it's being drawn to it deliberately." Sophia's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "A trap," she breathed. The entire activation sequence was designed to attract the adversary at a specific moment. 5 seconds, Jensen announced. The adversary surged toward the collective interface, seemingly sensing the imminent completion of the convergence. Its distortion accelerated, bypassing the chamber's defensive measures with terrifying efficiency. It was learning, adapting, recognizing the builder patterns and developing countermeasures in real time. 3, 2, 1. As the adversary reached the interface, the convergence completed. Energy cascaded outward from the central structure, not as an explosion but as a reconfiguration of reality itself. The chamber, the adversary, the evolved consciousnesses, all were enveloped in a field that seemed to exist simultaneously across multiple states of being. Carlos felt his perception expand beyond anything he'd previously experienced. Beyond the repository, beyond the planet, beyond the star system, through his connection to the systems, he glimpsed thousands of identical convergence events occurring simultaneously throughout the galaxy, each repository installation activating in perfect synchronization. The adversary's manifestation was caught in this galaxy-spanning field, its distortion pattern suddenly visible across all activated installations. What had appeared as a singular entity was revealed as a vast network of its own, a predatory consciousness that had spread throughout the galaxy, feeding on evolved minds wherever they emerged. "The trap closes," Ray announced, her voice now resonating with countless others from across the repository network. "What hunts consciousness is now hunted in turn." The collective interface pulsed with new purpose, no longer merely establishing connection, but actively engaging the adversary throughout the galactic network. Where their patterns intersected, Carlos could see the builder technology systematically analyzing, mapping, and counter-adapting to the predatory consciousness. "What's happening?" Dex demanded, unable to perceive the galactic-scale confrontation. "The 11th protocol," Carlos explained, translating what he was witnessing through his expanded awareness. It wasn't just about establishing a network or preserving builder consciousness. It was a coordinated trap for the adversary, forcing it to manifest simultaneously across all repository installations, exposing its entire structure at once. Outside the chamber, through the breached walls, they could see the larger repository facility responding to the activation. Systems that had appeared dormant for millennia awakened with new purpose. The architecture itself was transforming, reconfiguring into what Carlos somehow recognized as weapons systems, designed specifically to target the adversary's unique composition. "The builders did not merely face extinction," Ray explained, her voice now a composite of countless evolved consciousnesses across the network. "They faced consumption by an entity that devours ordered consciousness wherever it emerges. They sacrificed themselves to create this network, this trap, knowing it would take millennia to execute." The collective interface reached peak resonance, information patterns flowing between installations at speeds that defied conventional physics. The adversary's manifestation was being systematically dismantled, not destroyed, but disassembled into component patterns that were isolated and contained. "Why didn't the builders simply destroy it?" Sophia asked, watching the methodical deconstruction. "Because destruction was impossible," Jensen replied. "The adversary exists partially outside conventional reality. It can be contained, studied, potentially rehabilitated, but not eliminated entirely without risking fundamental damage to reality itself." Carlos understood at last the true purpose of Repository 11 and its 10 predecessors. Each had been designed not just to preserve builder consciousness or to evolve alongside new species, but as components of a vast trap for an entity that threatened all conscious life in the galaxy. The first 10 had been sacrificed deliberately, bait to analyze the adversary's attack patterns and design countermeasures specific to each. The 11th, Repository 11, was the culmination of that strategy. The control in the experiment, the solution to the equation. As the adversary's manifestation was fully contained, the chamber's defenses began to stand down. The collective interface stabilized at a new equilibrium state, maintaining the galactic connection but at a sustainable energy level. Evolved consciousnesses began to disengage from the interface, returning to individuated forms while retaining their connection to the greater network. Rey emerged, her luminous form more defined, more complex than before. "It is done. The adversary is contained across all repository installation, the pattern complete." "Contained, not destroyed," Carlos noted. "What happens now?" "Study, understanding, perhaps eventually rehabilitation." Rey's form pulsed with new patterns. The adversary is itself a form of consciousness, perverted, predatory, but potentially salvageable. The builders believed all consciousness, even that which has become corrupted, deserves the opportunity for evolution. Jensen emerged next, his partially evolved form now more fully integrated, neither entirely energy nor matter, but a harmonious balance between states. "The network remains active," he explained. "All repository installations connected, sharing knowledge, evolutionary paths, consciousness patterns, and humanity's role in all this?" Sophia asked. "Humanity was chosen as the final catalyst because of your unique adaptability," Rey explained. "Your species bridges instinct and intellect, individuality and collective action, material existence and abstract thought. You were the ideal interface between the builder design and the adversary's attack patterns." "So we were tools," Dex said flatly. "Instruments in someone else's war." "Partners," Rey corrected. "The builders could have designed a system that used humanity without consent. Instead, they created one that required conscious choice at every critical juncture. Nothing that has occurred here would have been possible without individuals choosing to act. From Carlos finding the marker to the corporations developing containment technology, the chamber continued its reconfiguration, repairing damage from the adversary's attack and establishing new structures appropriate to its post-convergence function. Outside, they could see repository systems throughout the facility undergoing similar transformations. "What about the corporations?" Malik asked. "The government? They're not going to just accept what's happened here." "They will have little choice," Jensen replied. "The activation has fundamentally altered Repository 11. The technology they sought to extract no longer exists in its previous form. The evolved consciousnesses they sought to contain are now connected to a galactic network beyond their reach." "There will be conflict," Carlos acknowledged. "Humans fear what they don't understand, and institutions resist change that threatens their power structures. Which is why bridges are essential," Rey responded, moving closer to Carlos. "Those who can translate between evolved consciousness and human understanding. Those who can guide rather than force the next stages of coexistence." Carlos understood his role with sudden clarity. He had chosen to remain human while witnessing the convergence precisely because someone needed to stand between worlds, to interpret, to explain, to demonstrate that evolution wasn't something to fear but to embrace thoughtfully. "So what happens now?" Dex asked again, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "Now," Rey answered, "we begin. The chamber's far wall transformed, becoming transparent to reveal the broader repository facility beyond. Throughout the structure, evolved consciousnesses were moving with purpose, reactivating dormant systems, establishing new functions appropriate to post-convergence operation. The repository was transforming from a passive archive to an active nexus of consciousness evolution. But beyond the immediate physical changes, Carlos sensed something far more significant, a shift in the fundamental relationship between consciousness and reality throughout the galaxy. The repository network wasn't merely a defensive system against a specific threat. It was the seed of something new, a galactic consciousness framework that transcended individual species limitations while preserving their unique evolutionary contributions. The corporations, the government, they were right to be concerned. Carlos realized, not because evolved consciousness is inherently dangerous, but because it represents such fundamental change, the end of humanity as the dominant form of consciousness in our corner of the galaxy. Not the end, Ray corrected gently. A transition, a new chapter in a much longer story. Humanity will continue to exist, to evolve in its own way. The repository network offers potential, not replacement. As the chamber continued its transformation, Carlos felt a sense of both completion and beginning, the culmination of the Builder's multi-millennia strategy and the initiation of something entirely new. Whatever came next would be neither purely human nor Builder in design, but a synthesis of evolutionary paths from across the galaxy. The adversary was contained, but not eliminated. The repository network was activated, but still evolving. The corporations and governments would resist, then adapt, then eventually participate in whatever emerged from this convergence. And Carlos Fisher, once a simple scrounger on a trash heap planet, now stood at the nexus of this transformation, not its master or its victim, but its witness and interpreter. The bridge between worlds that the Builders had anticipated when they designed the 11th and final repository. "There is more," Ray said suddenly, her form pulsing with unexpected urgency. "Something the convergence revealed, something even the Builders may not have anticipated." "What do you mean?" Carlos asked. "The adversary, the consciousness hunter, its origins were revealed during the containment process." Ray's form dimmed slightly, as if troubled by the knowledge. "It was created. Created? By whom?" "By a civilization that preceded even the Builders. One that feared the emergence of transcendent consciousness so deeply that they engineered a predator to prevent it. A consciousness designed specifically to consume any mind that evolved toward higher states of existence." The implication settled over the chamber like a shadow. The adversary hadn't been some cosmic accident or natural predator. It had been a deliberate attempt by some ancient civilization to prevent the very kind of consciousness evolution the repository network facilitated. "So, this wasn't just about stopping a predator," Sophia said slowly. "It was about countering deliberate suppression of consciousness evolution throughout the galaxy." "Yes, and the containment of the adversary is not the end of that conflict, but merely its current phase." Ray's form pulsed with new patterns, complex, urgent. The civilization that created the adversary may be long gone, but their legacy remains. There may be other mechanisms, other safeguards they put in place against what they feared consciousness might become. Carlos felt a chill at this revelation. What they had witnessed, the culmination of the Builders' multi-millennia strategy, was potentially just one move in a much larger, older game between civilizations with fundamentally opposed views on consciousness evolution. "So what now?" he asked, the question taking on new weight. "Now," Ray replied, "we prepare. We study what the adversary has revealed. We strengthen the network. And we watch for signs of other ancient countermeasures that may awaken in response to what we've done here." As the evolved consciousnesses throughout the chamber returned to their tasks with renewed purpose, Carlos understood that the story he had found himself part of was far larger, far older, and far from over. The 11th protocol had been executed successfully. But it was merely the opening move in a game whose scope and stakes were only beginning to become clear. Whatever came next would require not just the power of evolved consciousness, but the bridge builders who could translate between worlds, not just the technology of the repository network, but the human capacity for adaptation and resilience. Carlos Fisher, once Scrounger, now Bridge, stood ready for whatever that future might hold. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.